So welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, a resource center for Jewish engagement. This lecture is part of Antizionism, the History of an Ideology, a special six-part series hosted by Chai Mitzvah. The series examines the historical origins, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism. This series is sponsored by the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. Today's Scholars Circle topic is Part 5, From Conspiracy to Social Justice, the Intellectual Origins and Institutional Power of Progressive Anti-Zionism, with David Bernstein. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 17th year. We are the host of Scholars Circle, a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs of small group learning. Chai Mitzvah has engaged over 9,000 participants since its launch in 2009. We have over 20 curricula tailored to small group conversations for teens and adults, which can be lay or professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored the best-selling book Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionism conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. Scholars Circle has engaged over 5,000 participants since 10/7 from around the world. The Scholars Circle program hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics related to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email as well within 1 week. Thank you for our recent donors and also to our annual sponsor, the University of Connecticut, through their Laboratory for the Study and Prevention of Global Antisemitism. We welcome audience questions anytime. Please use the Zoom's Q&A box. Scholars Circle is a program of Chai Mitzvah, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Please consider supporting Scholars Circle with a donation, which is fully tax deductible. We now welcome Dr. Andrew Pessin to introduce our esteemed scholar. Andrew?
Hey there. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you to the fine folks at Chai Mitzvah and Chai Mitzvah Scholar Circle in particular. They do fantastic work. I actually used some of their curricula with my sons over the years. Wonderful stuff. And especially since October 7th, Chai Mitzvah just, jumped onto the scene with the Scholar Circle, and they brought just lots of important scholars helping us understand the dark and dangerous times in which we live. I am Andrew Pessin. I have launched the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism, this webinar series. I'm so grateful to Chai Mitzvah Scholar Circle for hosting it. It's a look at the history, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism. ICSA is a scholarly enterprise designed to promote and advance critical scholarship on anti-Zionism to go after this ideology, which has caused so much damage to the academy and so much harm to the Jews and the status of Israel on our campuses. Please check us out. Substack's the best way to follow us. ICSA, ICSA.substack.com. It is my pleasure to introduce David Bernstein. He is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas and a supporter of Israel's quest for peace and security. David is the founder of North American Values Institute, NAVI, formerly known as the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which opposes radical ideology in K-12 education. Campuses are a hot spot, but so are the K-12 is a real front in this battle, and thank goodness we have David on top of that front. He is the author of Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms the Jews, a fantastic book. Everyone should get that. By the way, everyone should donate a few dollars to Chai Mitzvah Scholar Circle as well. David is past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, former executive director of the David Project. He spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee in various senior roles. He's also a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, ISCAP, and a strategic advisor for the Combat Antisemitism movement. He is a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer, having written hundreds of opinion pieces in the Jewish and general press. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome David to the show. Thank you, David.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all. It's great to see such enthusiastic participation of this audience. And I'm so excited about the launch of this new institute in this general sort of intellectual journey that Andrew and others have gone on to really help shape the discourse around anti-Zionism and to get us off the defensive and onto the offensive. I think it's just exactly what was needed. And I'm glad to participate in this discussion. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I've been in the mainstream Jewish world my entire life, as Andrew read in my bio. That means that, you know, I've tended to support sort of center-left Jewish causes. I've always been a stalwart supporter of Israel. You know, I'm not a man of the right, as they say. I was always very interested in what was happening in my own ideological backyard. And in the spring of 2021, I believe it was actually exactly 25 years ago to the day, I wrote a memo to my American Jewish Committee colleagues about ideological trends that I was seeing among some of the civil rights organizations that I had been involved with. I started to see words like systemic racism emerge, which was very different than the kind of discourse I had long been part of. And I wondered whether this is going to pose a problem for the Jewish community. And I expressed that in the memo. You can read it actually in my book. So I started to see ideological change in the air, really going back decades. In 2013, 2014, and I'll talk more about this, I really noticed an abrupt shift on college campus. At that time, I was the head of the David Project, which was an Israel education and advocacy training program for college students. And I started to see an attitudinal shift among students that I'll describe in a little while that made me understand that we're moving into sort of different ideological terrain, and that we really should understand what's happening here because it could bleed into the community at large. It was what starts on campus never stays on campus, and I think that's precisely what we've seen in the last decade or so, which again I'll go into greater detail. So I saw the coming of wokeism, or what you might call critical social ideology, social justice. And I'll talk a little bit more about what these terms mean in a minute. But this is, so when I saw that, I realized that it was time for me to leave. The mainstream Jewish community hadn't caught on to these trends, wasn't going to catch on to these trends anytime soon. And I felt I had an uphill battle. I left in February 2026 for my job as CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And in the spring of 2021, I wrote a letter with Brett Stevens and Barry Weiss and Rabbi David Wolpe and Pamela Peresky and other key people, warning the Jewish community. It was an open letter warning the Jewish community of this radicalism that we were seeing, this oppressor-oppressed ideology in which people were either labeled oppressors or oppressed depending on their identities. And that was going to cause, we predicted, an uptick in anti-Semitism, and we were already seeing evidence of it. It was going to cause an uptick in anti-Zionism, and we were already seeing evidence of it. And it was going to cause people to see Jews as a privileged group. And we're seeing evidence of it. It also stifled dissent. And we in the Jewish community take pride in machloket l'shem hashamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. And this was shutting down the conversation. We were. In October of 2022, 1 year almost to the day before October 7th, my book came out, Woke Anti-Semitism, How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. And I really talked about what I was seeing, how I saw it, and how this ideology of woke anti-Semitism or wokeism was increasingly fomenting a new variant of anti-Semitism, and that we had to understand this, and that it was not enough just to fight the manifestation of anti-Semitism, but we had to fight it at the core of the ideology. We had to fight wokeism if we were going to prevent woke anti-Semitism, and that's still a position I hold today. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, we pivoted my organization, changed its name, and we became the North American Values Institute. And we decided to work full-time on K-12 education because we started to see this anti-Zionism and this radical oppressor ideology in K-12 classrooms. It got started in California with liberated ethnic studies, and it really spread very rapidly into K through 12 schools in different cities, different metropolitan areas, and different states. And right now, you can really, it's really astonishing the degree of radicalism we're seeing in K through 12 education and how that softens the ground for really extremist voices, including anti-Zionist voices. So I'm going to admit here, perhaps controversially, that initially when I was seeing this focus on anti-Zionism, I got a little annoyed. And why did I get a little annoyed? I had been working for the last few years to get the Jewish community to understand that this oppressed oppressor ideology was fomenting anti-Semitism. And here a group of upstarts, very smart people like Andrew Besson and Louis Klein and Naya Lecht and other people I respect were starting to shift the focus to anti-Zionism. But what I realized after I really dug into the literature and started hearing their voices, that the two really complemented each other a great deal. And that anti-Zionism correctly moved the lens, the focus off of right-wing anti-Semitism. Not that we don't have plenty of right-wing anti-Semitism, we do, but onto the threat the primary threat that most American Jews were facing in their own backyard. And that's anti-Zionism, and that's what I would call woke anti-Semitism, which is overlapping with anti-Zionism, but might be a little bit different. And we'll go there as well. Any questions? I guess I'm not supposed to do that because we'll do questions at the end. All right. A few key terms. You probably heard these terms. I don't know if you all have clear understandings of what they are. We'll talk about postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Postmodernism is a kind of scholarship that emerged in the 1950s and took hold in the 1960s in the academy, which holds that what we consider knowledge is really constructed by powerful forces that are trying to dictate how and embed their own power in the system. And it takes issue with everything we think we know about the world and says you're wrong. What you know or what you think you know is really just serving the powerful. A related idea to postmodernism is, I'm sure another term you've heard, is deconstructionism. And deconstructionism are a set of tools that grew out of postmodernism to show how power is embedded in our discourses, in our literature, and how we look at the world. And it tries to demonstrate that a lot of what we've learned through the canon, through Western philosophy and the like, was really constructed to serve powerful forces. And it tries to pull apart this discourse. Another school of thought that emerged around, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, is postcolonialism. This is sort of the study of how certain societies that were once colonized are now being oppressed. It's sort of the global North is oppressing the global South, and how that affects these societies, how the ongoing challenges that these societies face after being colonized. A related term you'll hear a lot of times is called settler colonialism. There's a fabulous book by Adam Kirsch called Settler Colonialism that you should all read. It's a short book. And it's about sort of the more modern practice. And of course, Israel's often accused of being sort of the paradigmatic case of settler colonialism in using settlers to go and colonize new lands. And another term you'll hear a lot is decolonization. And decolonization is the process of removing the colonial power. Now, you can think of this as, okay, the British or the French or the Italians, the colonizers, leaving those countries, and that's sort of classic decolonization. But the term has actually taken on new meaning, and you'll hear, for example, in social work schools that you have to decolonize social work, or in education schools that we should decolonize the curriculum or decolonize the syllabus. What do they mean by that? It's not like the French and the British have invaded the syllabus, right? What it means is that they believe that these Western influences, imperialistic influences, continue to dominate the way people learn and the way people do business. And so therefore we have to continue to shed these vestiges of Western thought that continue to oppress people. That's what is often meant by decolonization today. You should look out for these terms. The last set of definitions I want to talk about are wokeism. Wokeism, is a isn't exactly a technical term. The technical term you might say is critical social justice. And what do we mean by that? I know it's wokeism itself, or woke, is a controversial term. I don't really care to use it. I know I titled the book after it, but it sold copies. But what we mean by that are two fundamental things. Since Andrew Pessin is a philosophy professor, one of them is ontological. It's a claim that that there are systems of oppression built throughout our society. System that you heard the term systemic racism, for example, and this is and you can go beyond racism. There's systemic oppression of genderqueer people. There's systemic oppression of women. There's systemic oppression of other minority groups, marginalized communities. They would not use the word minority. They would use the word marginalized communities. And it's a claim that just really defines modern life. The second is what you might call an epistemology. It's or standpoint epistemology. It's this idea that only the people, only the marginalized groups really have the insight into what's happening. They see the systemic oppression better than the people who are complicit in the systemic oppression. We may not even realize we're being oppressors, this theory goes, but any marginalized community knows exactly how they were being oppressed. And so therefore, we have a responsibility to defer to these marginalized voices, to allow them to define the racism that we are seeing among us. So in other words, only Black people really understand racism, and we should defer to Black people on that. Not that every Black person is the same, but this is sort of how the ideology goes. Only women can understand sexism, only trans people, transphobia, only Jews, anti-Semitism. Well, not really Jews. Jews, we are of a category of our own. We are not viewed as a marginalized community. So therefore, we do not get to define the oppression that we face. More on that, I guess, in a bit. So I'm going to take you through a sort of a journey here, which is often called the long march through the institution. And this sort of tries to trace, and there's no way to do this without simplifying. Tries to tell you where we are today. What happened to get to the point where right now we're seeing anti-Zionism, we're seeing anti-Semitism in our institutions, we're seeing radical ideology. How did we get here? What did that look like? And it really started in the 1950s with the rise of postmodernism. I already defined postmodernism as sort of this idea that powerful forces get to define knowledge for the rest of society. And that became sort of the first move away from sort of the classical understanding of the world, classical academics and classical intellectual trends. In the late 1960s, there was the emergence of ethnic studies on university campuses. There were students who wanted to see a change in how subjects were taught. They wanted to inject sort of what you might call oppression or grievance studies into the universities, and they protested at the University of San Francisco. And eventually the president of the university folded and allowed the first ethnic studies program to be created. And within a few years, there were hundreds of these ethnic studies programs around the country. Many of them did not adhere to the normal standards of academic discourse or rigor. They were claims of oppression, and those claims of oppression often superseded what we might consider the kind of academic rigor and intellectual inquiry that we're accustomed to in campus. And that had a huge effect that took hold over many years. In 1968, by the way, I just wanted to say, before I wrote this a couple years ago, before the sort of new focus, what I call the new anti-Zionism started to emerge, and people like Andrew and Adam Lewis Klein and others, Naya came on the scene, and I thought I was going to have to go and change this to sort of stick the anti-Zionism narrative in there, but it was already there. So I want to let you know that I did not make any changes for this presentation, because I did see anti-Zionism and this sort of radical ideology that we're talking about, critical social justice, as sort of travel partners and very really distinct ideas. Zionism is specific ideology, modern ideology of the Jewish people's right to a homeland, but it suffered the same fate along with sort of the modern Western philosophy. And it's really important that we understand that. So the Soviets targeted Zionism. You can read Isabella Tabarovsky, who writes a lot about how the Soviets created a campaign to discredit Israel and to foment anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. There was a whole field that was developed called Zionology that Soviet propagandists created, and that had tremendous impact over time, because they invested millions of dollars into this endeavor, and it started to catch on. And so by 1975, we had the famous Zionism as racism resolution before the United Nations General Assembly. Again, that was a jumping off point of this discourse that we were seeing. 1978 is the publication of a book you've probably heard of called Orientalism by the erstwhile Palestinian American academic Edward Said. This book went, if there was no such thing as viral at that time, but if there was viral, it went viral. It ended up in every classroom of the humanities. I remember graduate school where I was taking Middle Eastern studies classes. The first book we were handed, we had to read Orientalism. And it basically took the ideas of postmodernism and deconstructionism, and it applied them to the Orient, or to the Muslim world, and said that it was a form of that we were imposing our perspective of these societies, the Muslim societies, with our Western categories, and we were not letting them speak for themselves. And it viewed a lot of the discourse, including by the great like Bernard Lewis, as a form of aggression, really aimed at the Muslim world. And that became extremely popular. And its categories were not just applied to the Muslim world, but really everywhere in the academia. So he took this sort of postmodern ideology and postcolonial studies, which really emerged out of this, and put it on steroids. 1984, we have this doctrine. This might seem like a sort of a marginal academic point, but these things are huge. They just this doctrine is called strategic essentialism, and it took this idea of postmodernism, which didn't really have a perspective other than everything you knew wasn't valid because it was all constructed by powerful forces, and said, listen, guys, that's all true, but it's not getting us what we want. It's not taking down the hegemonic powers that be. And so we have to have a doctrine that where we essentialize the marginalized groups, so that they can achieve their collective goals. In other words, it makes specific claims about oppression, which violated the terms of postmodernism, which says that you can't really say anything about anything. So there's a turn in this discourse around the mid-1980s. Around that same time is the sort of the rise of multiculturalism. Now, this is not my father's pluralism, right? In the years when the Jews came in the 19th and 20th century into what was an emerging pluralistic America, we were told of the melting pot, and yet we had to give up something. We were allowed to be Jewish religiously, but we were told that some of our culture had to be sort of privatized and not asserted in the public square, and that started to change in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it became a movement really in the mid-1980s, where people started to celebrate our differences. And it was around that time that we started to see various forms of diversity, equity, inclusion. That multiculturalism and the DEI that starts to emerge starts to take a more ideological turn in the late 1980s. There was a book called The Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh, and this popularized the idea of white privilege. In other words, it's not just that certain groups are oppressed, but other groups have privilege, and that we have to all acknowledge our privileged place in society so that we know the harm that we've done and continue to do to marginalized people. Around that same time, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a critical race theorist, develops this concept of intersectionality. Now, a lot of us understand intersectionality as sort of the coalition that has emerged among various left-wing causes, right? But actually, that's not what it meant in its original form. It's that one's social identities combine to either create different modes of discrimination or privilege. So in other words, if you're both Black and a woman, you face a kind of compounded oppression that you would not face if you were either just if you were a black male or you were a white woman. And so that starts to become very popular in the academy, and it takes on new forms. In 2001, again, going back to sort of the Jews, there was the Durban Conference. Now, the Durban Conference against xenophobia and racism, it might be racism, xenophobia, I can't remember which, against racism, yes, is held in Durban, South Africa. A lot of Jewish groups, including where I worked at the American Jewish Committee, sent representatives to this major international conference to address racism. And they came back, and I had friends who were there. I was working at the American Jewish Committee at that time, who were just stunned at what they experienced. There was this sort of rampage against the Jewish participants. There was hate literature passed out by some of the Arab groups that were there. And we saw that this conference had really given center stage, not just to anti-Zionism, although that was front and center, but post-colonialism. And one of the things that I've tried to get through to people is that you can't understand anti-Zionism if you don't understand post-colonialism. So as this post-colonial ideology started to catch on, and we were, and groups on the left were seeing the entire world through the prism of post-colonial ideology, that made it a lot easier for them to embrace anti-Zionism, which in some ways for them was the paradigmatic form of post-colonialism, right? Zionism was modern. Zionism, as Adam Kirsch said, you can't really do anything about the fact that the indigenous people of America were exterminated because there's few of them left and they're living in reservations, and we can't undo what was done. But for the post-colonial ideologues, they could still had hope that they could destroy Zionism, which they saw as a form of colonialism against the Palestinians. And that whet their appetite, and that was the modern day fight against colonialism. And that really took center stage in Durban. It's when we realized that we weren't living in a post-liberal reality. We were living in a very ideological reality, and it was the time we realized anti-Semitism, it's back. Around 2010, I went to work for the David Project, as I said, an Israel advocacy and training program for college students. And when I first got there, things were going pretty swimmingly. I mean, there were anti-Israel trends on campuses, but they were pretty contained. There was BDS, but it wasn't passed anywhere, and we were winning most of the BDS battles. And we thought that the primary thing we had to do was teach Jewish students how to be better advocates, how to build relationships with other communities and the like. I remember taking a group of students to Israel around 2012. These were student leaders of like the Black students and the like, the Asian student leaders, environmentalists. And we got there, and there was a student who I later learned had been a BDSer on her campus. And she came up to me at that trip and said, "Mr. Bernstein, I'm so sorry that I supported BDS. I didn't really understand Israel. You don't have to apologize to me. I'm glad that you've seen the complexity and the beauty of the Jewish state, blah, blah, blah." 2013, 2014, everything began to change. We started to feel in the air. Campus had become more ideological. And you can read about the shift in the book, a book by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt called The Coddling of the American Mind, where they really traced this back to two forces at that time: the Ferguson protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and Tumblr, which was a social media outlet that unleashed a lot of really radical voices, and it made students shift from sort of into sort of like what I would call hard postmodernism. They really embraced the oppressed narrative during that time. As you all know, this is when I call it, like you could even call it the mad dash toward through the institution. This is when things spread really quickly. And by 2020, the killing of George Floyd, it really lit a match of this whole movement. And we realized that we were entering some uncharted waters, and people in large swaths of society had bought into this oppressor-oppressed narrative. And it had to jump the lab into sort of society at large. And I thought I don't think a lot of people in the Jewish community really wanted to see it this way. They didn't understand how the ideology that we're seeing unfold in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder were actually playing out in their own institutions very often. But that's what was happening in my view, and I think it's pretty incontestable at this point. And then, of course, October 7th, 2023. And what I really should, the date should actually be October 8th. I should change that to October 8th because the Jewish community woke up to a different reality. 31 student groups at Harvard condemn Israel for the massacre that was just perpetrated against it 2 days after October 7th. It was on October 9th. We started to see these memes appear in many institutions lionizing the Hamas terrorists who had gone on their hand glides and murdered people at the Nova Music Festival. And I think if you didn't understand at that point that the oppressor ideology had unleashed some very dark forces in our society, you weren't going to understand it. But that's sort of my short version of the long march through institutions and where we are today. I want to just sort of say what do I think we need to do, and I'm probably running out of time, but I'm gonna spend a couple minutes here. I'm going to use short form. In my organization, we see two forms of this expression in K through 12 education, but I think you could probably see it in campus life as well. We call it Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 is the very explicit anti-Zionism and radical ideology that you see in places like Berkeley, California, and Chicago schools, Philadelphia schools, Minneapolis. You probably see a little bit of it everywhere, but in those places it has really become dominant. And because you have radical forces oftentimes from like the Democratic Socialists of America who have gained the upper hand in their school systems and their teachers unions and the like, and they're very brazen about it, and they teach classes about accusing Israel of genocide, and they share maps of Palestine without an Israel. This is what we're seeing in what we call Tier 1 cases. Tier 2 cases, where you see in a lot of blue areas as well, where they're not quite as brazen, and this is where they've embraced the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and those DEI bureaucracies have become deeply embedded in school systems. And my fear, and I think it's happening now, is that that in places like that, they soften the ground for Tier 1. In other words, they teach things like white supremacy culture framework. And if you don't believe me, you can look it up on the National Education Association, the largest teacher union in the country, on their website, where they talk about how values like being on time, like objectivity, or worship of the written word, I kid you not, are white supremacy values. Now, that doesn't directly invoke Israel, the Jewish people, but when you teach students to think that way, it's not a long leap for them to start to embrace anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic tropes as well. What do I think we need to do? I think we need to turn the tables on the people accusing us, which is why I love this new trend and this new field of critical anti-Zionism studies, because we're not just answering for our supposed sins, but we're accusing them of sort of ideological assault. And I think that is so important. I think it's important for the Jewish community to sort of overcome its reticence and to start to fight the good fight. I liked what Brett Stevens said at a recent talk. I think it was to Stand With Us at a Stand With Us dinner, when he said Stand With Us should rename itself to Don't F With Us. And I think that that's the kind of mentality we need. We need to go on the offensive, and that's something that I think mainstream Jewish communities have been reluctant to do, but I think it's long past due that we do that. We need to regain our footing in many institutions. I mean, I'm fighting the good fight on K through 12. I know others are fighting it on campus, but we've lost ground. While we were fighting the good fight at the federal level, and we were getting members of Congress who were sympathetic elected to public office, these activists were peopling the NGOs, and they were peopling the teachers unions, and they were peopling these school boards, and they were getting people elected at the very local level. And we thought that we could continue to sort of build a firewall between us and them. But what happened was that we start to face the downstream effects of their superior organizing abilities. And today you're seeing that in the Democratic Party in particular. You're seeing the influence of these progressive forces start to really take shape and shape our institutions. And now it even affects us in the US Congress, where you're seeing that where at one point we would overwhelmingly win every vote on Israel, we're now coming to a draw, and losing almost every Democratic vote. So we have to go back and start to fight the good fight in these institutions. We have to get people who are sympathetic to us to run for school board. They don't have to be Jews, by the way. They have to be rational people who don't want crazy DSA activists to continue to control what our kids learn. We have to win school boards. We have to win local elections. We have to win state elections. We've got to invest financially in a big way in winning at the local level, because that's where we lost. And that's why we're feeling what we're feeling today. And lastly, it's not enough just to stand against anti-Zionism. It's not enough to just to stand against radical critical social justice ideology or wokeism. We have to stand for something. And to me, we have to stand for American and Western values. These are the values of the Enlightenment. These are the values that sustain Jewish life in America. These are the values that let people talk to each other. They allow for intellectual inquiry. They allow for pluralism. They allow for dissent. And these are what our country was built out of, what allowed the Jewish community to thrive. And it's with the downfall of these basic values in our society, their marginalization, that we're seeing radical forces replace these values with either extremist right-wing views or extremist left-wing views that give rise to anti-Zionism and give rise to anti-Semitism. And I think we've got to go back. It's the 250th anniversary of the creation of this great nation. I think we've got to go back to reclaiming these core American and Western civic values. So why don't I stop there and take questions?
Oops. Wonderful. Thank you, David, so much. There was so much in there. Folks, please do put your questions in the Q&A box that should be on the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it in the bottom of your screen, it might be in the little circle with 3 dots that says more. Zoom has kind of rearranged the toolbar there, so please start putting your questions in there. I see a bunch are coming in. I had a couple questions just to start that came in along the way. But first, there's so much information. So if you were in the elevator pitch, so we have anti-racism, which isn't a term you use, but that's sort of another term for all of this.
Another term of trade, yes.
So how does one go from a place of anti-racism, believing in egalitarianism, to becoming an anti-Semite, let's say domestically, and then an anti-Zionist, internationally? Can you just, in like 2 or 3 steps, how do you go from that good place to that bad place?
See, look, I'm an anti-racist in the technical term. I'm opposed to racism. I don't want to see racism. But anti-racism in this sort of contemporary context does not mean you're opposed to racism. It is a very specific ideology. It draws on critical race theory. It's this idea that you can explain every deprivation, every disparity in American society through this oppressor lens. In other words, the reason why some groups do better than others are that the groups that do better are oppressing the groups that don't do as well. And so who does better? Jews do better on average. Not every Jew is wealthy. Not every Jew is well educated, but Jews do better on average. Indians do better than average. Asian Americans do better than average. And so therefore, if your only explanation for why there's disparity is that some groups are oppressing the other groups, then groups like Jews and groups like Indians and groups like Chinese will be linked with the white oppressors, because there's no other explanation that tells you why we're doing better. And when you apply that same oppressor-oppressed worldview globally, what country is doing better than all its neighbors? Israel. Israel's doing far better than all its neighbors. Israel's succeeding beyond our wildest dreams. So who are they oppressing in order to experience such success? Well, the Palestinians with the Arab world. And so if that's your only explanatory framework, that is what you're going to apply to Jews and what you're going to apply to Israel. And of course, we have the additional layer of anti-Semitism that is deeply buried in our cultural subconscious. That it's hard to explain. I was just talking to David Hirsch, one of the great anti-Semitism scholars of our time, about this, and both of us were musing at the fact that we know it's there, but we don't know why, but it's there. And so when you combine that with this the oppressor ideology, it becomes very clear why Zionism is sort of is being picked on, because because it's a success story, and success stories by their very nature mean that they're oppressive. So that's why, if you want to fight against this variant of anti-Semitism, you've got to also oppose the ideological roots of it, which are this oppressor-oppressed ideology.
I remember the first conversation we had when I first met you a few years ago. We talked about the DEI industry, and at the time there was a discussion in the community, and it's still ongoing, of maybe to protect Jews on campuses, we need to get DEI to protect them, because after all, DEI is all about inclusion, and it's supposed to help all the embattled minorities, and Jews indeed are embattled minorities on campuses. And I remember you very clearly, two or three, and I was sort of in that camp at that time, and you very clearly at the time said that something along these lines, that the DEI industry, which reflects this ideology that you've just expressed, has in its genes or in its blood or in its bones hostility to Jews. Jews will never be able to fit into that framework. And I think you were proven prophetically correct, certainly after October 7th, when, one of the big scandals was DEI groups tended to side on the side of the massacre as opposed to.
Yeah. I think it was Voltaire who said, about the Holy Roman Empire, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Yeah. And DEI, unfortunately, is not about diversity. It's not about equity. It's not about inclusion. It can be. There are forms of it that are perfectly acceptable, and some of them I'd even support. But DEI, as practiced by most institutions, is an ideology about oppressed and oppressor. And it's meant to embed that ideology into the pedagogies and into the work practices of institutions. And that's why it's a problem.
Do you feel there's a baby in the bathwater problem here, which is that this progressive ideology arose at the time that it did because there were serious problems that needed addressing, and it began to address them and had some value. For example, you mentioned the concept of systemic racism. Like, I thought that was a pretty important discovery, and there was value to that. But is the baby still in the bathwater? Has it been drowned at this point? Is there any value, or is it?
Yeah, look, I believe in diversity. I want to live in a diverse society. I want to live in a society where we acknowledge people's differences and we celebrate them, and that we talk and break bread together and all of the above. And I want to make sure that we give everybody opportunity in society. Unfortunately, that's not what DEI became. There is some danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Sometimes some of the critics of DEI become extremely shrill and I think demeaning in how they talk about it. Because I do think we should be sensitive to our own history. And all these critiques have some validity. I mean, of course, the structural explanation of racism has some validity. This idea that only oppressed groups can articulate the oppression has some validity. I mean, I'm Jewish. I've experienced anti-Semitism. You should at least listen to what I have to say. But like all ideological dogmas, they tend to become sort of one size fits all explanations, and that's when they become dangerous. Yeah. So as a result, they stifle discourse. They say you can't argue that there's any other explanation for this but the one I'm giving you, and they become deeply illiberal, and that's when they become very susceptible to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
I wonder if what you're saying helps explain one of the particularly puzzling aspects of the post-October 7th landscape, namely the tearing down of hostage posters. And, on the one hand, I can understand that as like a tactic or something like that. But given the ideology you're describing, I wonder if the following makes sense, which is on their ideology, basically Jews, once they're coded as oppressors, can't possibly be victims. There's just no room in the idea for victim. And so some of the people tearing down those posters weren't tearing it down because they just wanted to silence it. They just made no sense to them. They couldn't possibly be true because Jews couldn't be victims, and that's what these posters were saying. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's there was this formula that came out of sort of anti-racism, critical race theory, that racism equals prejudice plus power, right? So and so the idea is that if you didn't have power, if you had power, if you didn't have power, you couldn't be a racist because you don't have power. You're not really doing anything. You can be prejudiced, but you can't be a racist. And if you do have power, you can't really be a victim because no one's really harming you. Only marginalized communities that supposedly have no power, and I think that's a flawed idea of what power is, to be honest with you, are victims, and only and people that are oppressed can never be oppressors, or people who are not marginalized can never really be oppressed. So I think that's what this discourse does to us, and you just know where Jews are going to fall in that schema.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you explain this? There's a series of questions like this. How do you explain left-wing supporters of women's rights and LGBT, etc., supporting ultimately the alliance with the Islamists? I think is what we're getting at here, right? So these left-wing progressives who reach the anti-Zionism end up allying with the Islamists and other ideologies that are, sexist and homophobic, etc. What goes on in their brains? How can we understand that?
Yeah, look, I mean, what you said it already, that if we can't be victims, in other words, if little Israeli children who were murdered on October 7th can't be victims, then Israeli women can't be raped, or that the rape doesn't matter, because the victims, the true victims, were the Palestinians who crossed into Israel and did the murdering. That's what decolonization looks like, in this worldview. So look, I think there are people on the progressive left who weren't quite so extreme, who were uncomfortable with this. But in such movements, there's this pressure to defer to the most marginalized voices, and or the perceived most marginalized voice. And so when you started to see the campus protests and the like of the spring of 2024, you saw a lot of really radical Arab voices on campus, activists on campus, really force everybody else to fall in line, and they're not willing to divert from that consensus. That's sort of the intersectional consensus, and it's remarkable that it can make people who you think would know better believe that Israel's more oppressive toward gay people or queer people than Gaza. I mean, of course, that's untrue. But when you look at the world through this binary lens, that's what you end up with.
Is it also the case, that's an interesting analysis of the dynamic on campuses, that in at least many cases, the most radical, not everyone's so radical, but the radical people sort of drive the agenda and everyone falls in. So
Yeah.
does the
Yeah, and I
ideology
think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that throughout society right now. Is that
that's
it's the rapidly disappearing middle that's still the vast majority of Americans, and all we hear are the online right and the ideological left, and it makes us it creates the illusion of power. It creates the illusion of the majority, even though they're the minority. And so people don't want to sort of offend anybody. They don't want. There was that famous saying, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it. And we don't. Yeah, and so what happens is that no one wants to wrestle with a pig, so they sort of just fall in line, or they pretend they don't hear it. And some people are, over time, because no one's wrestling with a pig, no one's wrestling with these ideologues, no one's calling them out, they end up appearing to be much stronger than they are. And some people over time fall in line.
I think they've also established the ideology that since they're anti-racist, any questioning or challenging of what they're doing makes you a racist, and so people become hesitant to challenge the most extreme.
Absolutely, no one wants to be called a racist.
Right. So that segues to the next question, which is how much of this woke anti-Zionism is due to interference from bad foreign actors, and how much is academic trendiness? Is there a way to
Yeah, boy,
portion?
it's really hard. That's a great question. It's really hard to sort that out. um I've always been of the mind that the majority of this is just homegrown ideology, but that doesn't mean that the Qataris and the Chinese aren't doing a lot to foment this in their various ways. I think following the money is really important, and it will tell you a story. Following the money, by the way, is not just foreign interference; it's also domestic domestic funders, philanthropies like the Ford Foundation and some others that fund these radicals. I think that they are also playing a role. But a lot of this, we have to understand, is really just organic to the sort of intellectual trends that have been around for a very long time and have caught fire on the left, and now we're paying the price for that. So it's hard to sort those two out. They both exist. Both are factors. Sometimes I've come to appreciate the role that funding plays more now than I did maybe a couple of years ago, now that I know more about it.
Well, in the news, when I'm reading about the funding, that is primarily focused on campuses. Are you finding that like foreign funding is relevant to the K through 12 arena as well? Are they getting in on that front, or?
Yeah, it's harder to trace than on campus, but I'll give you an example. Like there are Qatari funded Arabic language programs where they send where they send public school teachers for to Qatar for training in Arabic language. And guess what? They come back and they're organizing, protests and the like, and they're politicizing the classroom. And so we are definitely seeing that. There were also curricula like the Brown University partnered with the Qataris on a curriculum called Choices. My organization was able to get it out of 6 states. And I don't think I think it's being taught in fewer
Now
schools
shut
than it
down.
once was.
Shut it
What's
down.
that?
It's now shut down.
It's now Brown University ended its sponsorship, but that doesn't mean that there aren't schools that are still using the Choices program.
Oh, I didn't
And
know that.
several of them are using it still
Oh, you're just
in
throwing
their state.
bad news, but okay. I was excited when I heard that they shut it down, but it's still out there.
It's still out there. And part of what we're dealing with, what one of my colleagues, Daniel Newman, called the education gig economy. Like we don't have a unified curriculum in this country, and everybody can make their own Chabbats, right? And so a teacher can go on the internet the night before class and go on one of dozens and dozens of curriculum sites and find whatever materials they're looking for. And that might include, Palestine Toolkit and the like, and they can get training from wherever they want, and they can end up bringing their own unique ideological perspectives into the classroom and teach it as if it's, if it's fact, settled truth. And that's what's happening as well. Some of this is coming through that gig economy.
Or federal standards or something like that, like a review board. How would we address that problem?
Yeah. Well, one is we need more transparency legislation as well. We need acts. There are some states that have transparency laws that require schools to share what they're learning. A lot of them skirt these issues. In Maryland, where I live, a group of parents have the right under Maryland law to look at curriculum, and they brought them into a library and they said, you have 45 minutes, and they put piles of books and curriculum on the table to say for them to review. So that they're not good faith actors very often. They don't want the scrutiny, and they do everything they can to avoid it. But I think transparency is absolutely key. We also have to fight more generally for depoliticized classrooms. Look, I always tell people the Israeli flag doesn't need to be in a classroom once you think that it's okay to have the Israeli flag, and it's very rare, by the way, you're going to see Palestinian flags, you're going to see every other flag, you're going to see teachers espouse their specific ideological positions. And what we want really are depoliticized classrooms where kids are learning to think, where kids are learning math and reading skills and the like, not how to be ideologues, not how to go out and protest ICE, as we're seeing in Chicago schools and other places. We want teachers to help kids learn how to think, not what to think.
So there's a related question about teachers' unions. So what do we do about the teachers' unions? Because all I read about is they're infested with anti-Zionism.
They're absolutely infested with anti-Zionism, and there's radical ideologues who get very organized. They get themselves elected. They form caucuses within the NEA and the FT, the 2 major teachers unions. They start to push their agenda. They get their views ensconced in policy. They, in some local areas, they take over the Democratic Party. The teachers unions in Chicago got a radical mayor elected in Brandon Johnson. We see that elsewhere as well, Mamdani and other places. They're using the teachers union as really a political party.
How do we wrest back the teachers unions from this control?
There are legislation in some states like Florida that weaken teachers unions. I've never been a union buster, but myself, and I've always believed in unions, and I've even been in a collective bargaining unit myself. But I'm watching what's happening. I'm watching this sort of ideological infestation of these unions, and I think it's time that we take seriously sort of legislative fixes to this, so that a teacher who doesn't want to have their salary deducted automatically from their paycheck can do that. And that teachers unions have to get constantly recertified, and other ways of weakening their hold on public policy. And we've got to be much better organized than we are. We have to fight at the local level. In places like Chicago, there are new initiatives where Jews and other civic leaders have gotten to neutralize the effect of teachers unions by organizing school board candidates or running people for school board and investing in their campaigns and getting moderates elected to public office. It's not just about getting pro-Israel people elected. It's about getting moderates elected, because that's the real change that we're seeing as radicals being elected to these local offices.
All right, we're just about out of time. Audrey's about to pop back in, but one last question to squeeze in. First of all, it must be a little painful for you, a longtime left-leaning person, to be talking about union busting, but that's how bad the situation is, I bet. But the final question is, what should Jews give up on public schools? Should we go to private schools? Apparently, a few years ago, you were advocating for focusing on public schools. So the person's asking if you've changed your mind at all. And if you could do a real quick answer to that one.
Yeah, look, even if there are no Jews in public schools, we have a problem with public schools, right? It's not just the Jews. I don't want a whole generation of Americans to learn that Israel committing genocide. Okay, so what individual parents decide with their own children is up to them. And I've had kids in public schools, and I've had kids that went to Jewish day school through 12th grade, and I think those are legitimate choices. But what I do think we need to do is we have to fight whether our kids are in those schools or not. And some parents are going to have kids in public schools because it's their only option. We've got to fight for them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Remember, ixa.substack.com to find out more about the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. And I turn it back to Audrey to close us out.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrew. There were so many questions, and we didn't get to most of them. So I encourage you to reach out to NAVI, the North American Values Institute, to learn more. There's clearly lots and lots of interest. We'll have to rethink this topic and maybe do another session on it at least. So this lecture will be recorded and will be sent to you on your email along with the resource guide and ways that you can get in contact with David Bernstein as well within a week. Our next Scholars Circle lecture is the final part of our 6-part series, and it will be featuring Adam Lewis Klein on Tying It All Together, Anti-Zionism, Holistic Ideology. That will be on Thursday, May 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register at scholarscircle.org, join scholarscircle.org, and please consider again a donation to support these free lectures. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you on May 7th at 7 p.m. Good night.